January 1940, on a gray morning when the world had not yet learned the full mathematics of modern warfare, in the observation posts scattered across the Rhine, in the orderly tents of the Wehrmacht's expanding formations, in the strict barracks of the Third Reich's military machine, a soldier receives his daily allocation. 6 cigarettes, a bureaucratic allowance precise and calculated, representing exactly what Berlin's planners deemed sufficient to maintain morale among the millions now flowing into the ranks. Each cigarette measured, wrapped, distributed. The number would never change throughout the entire war. 6 cigarettes daily, while across the Atlantic in factories that would come to dwarf all German production combined, American manufacturers were preparing a different kind of arsenal entirely. This is not a story about nicotine. It is not a medical narrative about the lungs or the blood vessels that cigarettes would inevitably damage. Rather, this is an account of how 2 industrial systems measured abundance differently, how 2 ideologies communicated their power through the smallest of objects, and how a single cigarette, scarce on one side, lavish on the other, would become a symbol of something far more significant than itself. The cigarette would become a messenger of inevitable defeat, a tiny ambassador announcing that one nation had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict it had chosen to fight. By January 1940, the Wehrmacht stood at the threshold of a new chapter in European history. The Polish campaign had concluded barely 4 months earlier. The machinery of conquest seemed to be working. The military structures were sound. The planning was meticulous. The racial ideology that animated the regime had been translated into tactical doctrine. And yet already in the quiet moments between formations and marches, a disparity was becoming visible to those who looked carefully. Not in weapons or tactics, the German engineering was genuine and formidable, but in something else, in supply, in the gap between what soldiers were theoretically entitled to receive and what they actually consumed. The regulation stipulated 7 cigarettes daily for Wehrmacht personnel. 7. But by 1940, this theoretical maximum was already becoming fiction. The shortage of foreign currency meant that Germany could not sustain adequate tobacco imports. Turkey, the primary source of German tobacco, could only supply limited quantities. The Reich's monetary reserves, which had been vast in the 1930s, were being consumed by rearmament at a rate no economic planner had truly anticipated. And so the bureaucratic allocation contracted. 7 became 6. And then, as the war deepened and the industrial costs mounted, 6 cigarettes would come to represent an aspiration rather than a reality. The irony was profound. Adolf Hitler himself, the supreme leader whose will shaped every decree of the regime, was a fierce opponent of smoking. He issued posters throughout Germany warning women that cigarette smoke was unfeminine, that smoking damaged health, that the practice represented a weakness incompatible with Nazi ideology. The regime implemented what historians would later recognize as among the first organized anti-smoking campaigns in the world. There were designated smoking zones in military installations. Indoor smoking was prohibited in many official spaces. Cigarettes were taxed heavily, with the state attempting to discourage the very habit it simultaneously felt compelled to encourage among its troops. This contradiction revealed a deeper truth about the Nazi state. It was simultaneously attempting to control every aspect of human behavior, while also understanding that it could not eliminate certain behaviors without destroying morale. Soldiers needed to smoke. The military psychiatrists and commanders agreed because smoking calmed the nerves in moments of terror. It provided psychological relief during the crushing monotony of military life. It offered a punctuation mark in the day, a small ritual that created structure in chaos. And so, despite the ideological opposition at the highest levels, cigarettes remained in the ration system. 6 per day, a small concession to human nature, offered by a regime that had declared war on human nature itself. Across the ocean, in the United States, a completely different calculation was being performed. The American system did not begin from scarcity. It began from abundance. American industrial capacity in 1940 was something the world had never witnessed before. The factories of the Midwest and the Northeast hummed with production that seemed limitless. Steel, copper, rubber, gasoline, all flowed in quantities that appeared almost surreal to planners in other nations. And tobacco? America produced tobacco at scales that made the Turkish supply routes seem quaint and fragile. Kentucky and Virginia and North Carolina, Generations of farming expertise. Entire regional economies organized around the crop. When the United States military began calculating what soldiers would need, the answer came back: abundance. The K-ration system, developed specifically for American soldiers who would need to move quickly, to parachute behind enemy lines, to operate in theaters where supply lines might be uncertain. The K-ration included cigarettes from the beginning. Not as a luxury, not as a psychological aid to be rationed carefully, but as a standard component of the meal, as fundamental to the soldier's day as the biscuits or the canned meat or the powdered coffee. 4 cigarettes per meal unit, 3 meal units per day, 12 cigarettes daily as part of the standard ration, and that number barely scratched the surface of American tobacco availability. Beyond the rations, American soldiers could purchase cigarettes at the post exchange, the PX, the ubiquitous base store that appeared wherever Americans established a military installation. The prices were subsidized, deliberately kept low by command, recognizing that cigarettes were not merely consumable goods but morale devices, psychological necessities in the arsenal of military effectiveness. A pack of 20 cigarettes, Lucky Strike Chesterfield Camel, cost only 5 cents at the American base exchanges. For an American soldier earning $30 per month in basic pay, cigarettes were affordable luxuries, nearly free in practical terms. They could be purchased in unlimited quantities. They accumulated in footlockers and pockets. They were so abundant that they became trading currency, valuable enough to trade, but numerous enough to give away. But the most significant difference lay not in the official rations but in what happened when American soldiers encountered situations where they might have the opportunity to capture or encounter German supplies, or more crucially, what happened when the situation reversed, when it was the American supplies that fell into German hands. The historical record preserves for us a moment that encapsulates this asymmetry with almost theatrical precision. In the late spring of 1943, during the campaign in North Africa, German forces under the command of Africa Corps officers encountered American supply dumps. The quantities they discovered were staggering. 57,000 tons of American supplies fell into German hands at Kasserine Pass: food, ammunition, gasoline, clothing, medical equipment, and among all of this abundance, cigarettes. Everywhere cigarettes. Not in limited allocations measured by bureaucrats, but in enormous cartons, stored with the casual confidence of a nation that could produce what it needed faster than it could consume it. Friedrich Schultz, a Panzer Company commander who participated in these operations, later recorded his observations in accounts that emerged after the war. The shock of American abundance was not incidental to his military assessment. It was central to it. Here, in the desert of North Africa, in the midst of combat thousands of miles from the main German industrial centers, the Wehrmacht found itself consuming supplies that had been manufactured in American factories, shipped across an ocean in American vessels, and stored in quantities that suggested something fundamentally different about the nature of the conflict itself. The German soldiers found American cigarettes to be of higher quality than what they could obtain in the rations of their own army. The tobacco was fresher. The papers were whiter. The packaging was superior. The brands, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, became legendary among German troops not because of any inherent superiority of the tobacco, but because of what they represented. The product of a nation that could afford to make cigarettes in quantities so large that they could be distributed, captured, bartered, and still remain abundant. By 1944, the scarcity had become critical. The Dresden cigarette factory, one of the primary manufacturing centers for German military cigarettes, was increasingly vulnerable to Allied bombing. The supplies that had been adequate in 1939 were becoming impossible to obtain in quantities that matched the size of the Wehrmacht by the mid-war years. The factories in Dresden that produced the rations, the carefully designed packages that contained either 6 cigarettes with white paper or smaller quantities in alternative packaging, were operating at reduced capacity as bombing raids disrupted production, destroyed machinery, and killed workers. In May 1944, on the eve of the Normandy invasion, Wehrmacht officers kept records of what was theoretically available to troops. Wilhelm Hoffmann, an officer serving with the 352nd Infantry Division stationed in Normandy, recorded in his diary a conversation with a supply sergeant. "The space supply sergeant laughed when I asked about our cigarette ration," Hoffman wrote. 6 per day. We had received 6 per week for the last 2 months, and those were French captures from 1940. So stale they crumbled when lit. This entry is not merely anecdotal. It is documentary evidence of how completely the allocation system had collapsed. The theoretical ration of 6 cigarettes daily had become a theoretical ration of less than 1 per day. The cigarettes themselves, when they arrived at all, were stale captured stock from 4 years earlier, so deteriorated that they were essentially inedible, the tobacco so dry it fragmented in the hand. A soldier in Normandy in May 1944, facing the greatest invasion in European history, smoking cigarettes that had been captured from French supplies during the 1940 campaign, this was not a detail of mere historical color. This was a symptom of systemic failure in the Wehrmacht supply chain, a visible manifestation of the industrial disparity that would determine the war's outcome. Meanwhile, American soldiers landing on the beaches of Normandy carried with them rations that included, among other provisions, cigarettes. 12 per day is the baseline, with the possibility of purchasing additional supplies from the exchanges that had been established behind the lines. The supply ships bringing reinforcements across the channel brought not merely weapons and ammunition but luxuries, including cigarettes in quantities that military planners regarded as standard military provisioning. The Quartermaster Corps of the United States Army had calculated that morale would be maintained if every soldier had ready access to cigarettes, and this calculation was budgeted into the logistics of the entire European campaign. The contrast became physically manifest in the hands of soldiers. An American infantryman carrying his pack into combat would have at minimum a carton of cigarettes, often more. Captured photographs from the period show American soldiers with packs overflowing with cigarettes, with the surplus from rations visible in the exterior pockets of uniforms, sometimes with cigarettes being distributed freely to liberated French civilians or to German prisoners as the campaign progressed. The abundance was so complete that cigarettes became a medium of exchange between soldiers, a currency more reliable than money, more transferable than any other commodity. By contrast, a German soldier captured after the Normandy campaign would be searched, and his personal effects would be recorded, cigarette cases, many of them empty, attempts to barter for cigarettes from guards, desperate inquiries about whether more cigarettes would be provided. One German soldier, captured at St. Lo, was found to have carved a small pipe from wood, apparently attempting to extend the utility of the cigarettes he possessed by converting them into pipe tobacco, and thereby making them last longer. The psychological difference was encoded in the physical artifacts soldiers carried. What followed would transform the meaning of the cigarette entirely, at least for German soldiers. The transport of German prisoners to the United States, beginning in large numbers in 1943 and continuing through 1944 and 1945, exposed German soldiers to a completely unprecedented abundance. Approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war would eventually be held in camps throughout the United States. These camps, designed according to Geneva Convention standards that American commanders insisted on maintaining scrupulously, included supply facilities where prisoners could purchase goods. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, at Camp Hearn in Texas, at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, the canteens displayed goods that seemed impossible to German prisoners, who had come from a nation where rationing had become increasingly severe, where consumer goods had largely disappeared, where families back home were bartering wedding rings for cigarettes on the black market. Here in American camps, cigarettes were available at 5 cents per pack, not scarce, not rationed, not limited to 6 per day, but available, purchasable, accessible in quantities that seemed to contradict everything German propaganda had claimed about American weakness and poverty. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, who had been captured with the 21st Panzer Division and transported to an American camp after months of waiting in holding facilities, wrote to his mother 8 months after arriving in the United States. In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration, the Liberty ships that carried German Prisoners across the Atlantic were themselves products of a kind of industrial magic that had seemed impossible before the war. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. A ship, complete, ready for ocean transit, constructed in less time than it took for a German soldier on leave to journey from the Western Front back to his hometown and return. These vessels, produced at a rate of 3 per day at the peak of production during 1943 and 1944, were returning from delivering military supplies to the European theater. Rather than sail empty on the return voyage, they carried human cargo. Up to 30,000 prisoners per month in the summer of 1943, the fact that the United States possessed not merely the military capacity to wage war on this scale, but also the merchant shipping capacity to transport enemies to internment camps thousands of miles away. This was itself a demonstration of industrial power that undermined every claim Nazi propaganda had made about German superiority. When the German prisoners arrived at the camps, they encountered a reality so foreign to their experience that many struggled to interpret it accurately. The American Hershey Company was manufacturing 24 million chocolate bars weekly, exclusively for military rations. Each bar was engineered to withstand temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, to maintain structural integrity through rough handling, to provide approximately 600 calories of nutrition. These bars were distributed to soldiers, yes, but they were also available in the camp stores where prisoners could purchase them. For men who had come from a nation where real chocolate had become nearly impossible to obtain, where substitutes made from coal tar and other industrial materials had replaced the genuine article in civilian rationing, the encounter with American chocolate was almost overwhelming in its implications. One German prisoner, in a letter that survived the war and was later documented by historians, recorded his reaction upon receiving his first genuine chocolate bar in an American camp. "They gave us chocolate. Not the imitation we had been told was chocolate in Germany, but real chocolate. It was brown and smooth, and it tasted like the chocolate from before the war, from when I was a child in Berlin. I thought of my son, who has never tasted real chocolate, who has never known what true chocolate tastes like. And I realized everything they told us was a lie. The cigarettes operated on the same psychological register: an American Lucky Strike cigarette, a Chesterfield brand cigarette. These were luxury goods to a German prisoner who had been smoking stale, captured French cigarettes, or ersatz tobacco substitutes when the genuine article had been impossible to obtain, or nothing at all during the final months of the war, when the manufacturing infrastructure had been destroyed. The cultural weight that cigarettes carried in German society at that moment cannot be overstated. The black market price for cigarettes in Germany in 1944 and 1945 was astronomical. Young people who had never smoked regular cigarettes formed smoking habits in American camps, habits that would persist long after the war ended. Former German soldiers who were eventually released or repatriated would return to Germany bearing testimony to what they had experienced: that America was not weak, was not decadent, was not in the process of decay, but was rather possessed of an industrial capacity and a material abundance that dwarfed anything Germany could produce. The sociological impact emerged gradually as the prisoners were repatriated after the war. Among the 425,000 German prisoners held in American camps, many underwent a transformation in their ideological understanding. The theoretical education American camp commanders attempted to provide, lessons about democracy, about freedom, about the nature of constitutional government, was less effective than the simple fact of material reality. A soldier who had been told that American workers were slaves to capitalist masters could observe American guards who spoke without fear of contradiction, who were not subject to ideological supervision, who seemed to possess a kind of personal autonomy that was foreign to German military culture. A soldier who had been told that America was militarily weak, economically inferior, culturally degenerate, could receive cigarettes at prices that suggested immense productive capacity, could eat chocolate manufactured in quantities that seemed impossible, could be held prisoner in camps whose scale and organization exceeded what had been possible in the Third Reich. The cigarette ration, therefore, became something more than a morale device. It became an object lesson in comparative systems, in the tangible difference between propaganda and reality. The lesson was written not in documents or speeches, but in the act of smoking. Each cigarette consumed by a German prisoner in an American camp was an implicit statement. This nation that we were told was weak is so powerful that it can afford to give these luxuries even to its enemies. This nation that we were told was poor is so wealthy that cigarettes cost 5 cents. This nation that we were told was decadent has maintained the discipline to build an industrial machine that produces cigarettes, chocolate, and Liberty ships at rates that seem impossible. By February 1945, the difference had become absolute. The bombing of Dresden on the night of February 13th and the morning of February 14, 1945, destroyed much of what remained of German manufacturing capacity. The cigarette factory in Dresden, which had struggled through years of war to maintain production levels that never matched demand, was incinerated in the firestorm. German soldiers attempting to withdraw from the collapsing front, attempting to maintain some continuity of supply and structure in the final weeks before surrender, found themselves unable to obtain even the theoretical 6 cigarettes per day. Captured supply records from units withdrawing from the Eastern Front in the final months of 1945 show allocations of less than 1 cigarette per week, with most soldiers smoking foraged tobacco, pipe tobacco salvaged from officers' kits, or nothing at all. In contrast, American soldiers advancing through Germany in April and May 1945 were receiving K rations that continued to include cigarettes. The production lines in American factories were still operating at full capacity. The merchant shipping bringing supplies to the advancing armies maintained its schedule. The abundance that had characterized the American military supply system from the beginning of the war had actually increased as the manufacturing base had expanded and more nations had joined the production effort through Lend-Lease agreements and direct manufacturing for American use. The symbolic power of the cigarette at the moment of surrender cannot be overstated. German soldiers laying down their weapons at the end of the war often made requests to American soldiers for cigarettes. This detail has been preserved in numerous historical accounts, often narrated with a tone of mild humor or bewilderment by American veterans. But the request was not humorous to the German soldiers making it. It was profound and desperate. The cigarette represented the substance they had been promised would be available, that had been theoretically guaranteed by their government, but that had ultimately been denied them. It represented a hunger for the material security that the American system had been able to provide to its own troops and even, at the moment of victory, to extend to its defeated enemies. One American soldier, after lighting a captured German soldier's cigarette, was asked where the American got the cigarette. "From a pack," the American responded casually. "We get them in every ration, plus we can buy more at the exchange." The German soldier apparently laughed in a manner that suggested emotional breakdown rather than humor. The thought that soldiers received cigarettes in every ration, that there were bases where more could be purchased cheaply, that this was the standard provision for military personnel in the American Army. It was too much cognitive dissonance. The statement seemed to be the ultimate proof that the war was truly over, that an entire world of assumptions and expectations had been inverted. The ideological transformation that emerged from this encounter with American abundance extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Among the German prisoners released or repatriated to West Germany, many became advocates for the Marshall Plan, for economic integration with the West, for the rebuilding of Germany along capitalist rather than socialist lines. These were not arguments made from theoretical conviction. These were arguments made by men who had experienced firsthand what industrial capacity and economic freedom could produce. They had seen Liberty ships built in 4 days. They had smoked American cigarettes at 5 cents per pack. They had eaten Hershey chocolate manufactured in quantities that were impossible in Germany. And they had concluded, not from propaganda but from lived experience, that the system that produced these things might be worth adopting rather than resisting. The cigarette was the symbol, but the reality was systemic. The Third Reich, for all its military innovations and tactical brilliance, had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of the conflict it had chosen to wage. The Blitzkrieg doctrine assumed a short war, a swift victory before economic disparities became relevant. But when the short war became a long war, when the conflict extended into years rather than months, the materials and supplies and industrial capacity that had seemed secondary in 1940 and 1941 became absolutely central to the outcome. Germany could produce approximately 290 billion cigarettes during the entire span of 1943. In the same year, the United States produced approximately 290 billion cigarettes. But this American production was only one small component of the overall manufacturing effort. The factories producing cigarettes were not being diverted from other production. They were a small fraction of the overall industrial capacity. Meanwhile, German industrial policy had to sacrifice civilian production entirely to attempt to maintain military supplies, and still the supplies were insufficient. The 6 cigarettes per day that had been promised to German soldiers were a microcosm of the entire planning failure. The planners in Berlin had calculated consumption based on theoretical military doctrine. They had assumed that shortages could be managed through rationing and discipline. They had not anticipated that a modern industrial war would require supplies in quantities that overwhelmed the capacity of any individual nation acting in isolation. They had certainly not anticipated that one of their enemies would possess manufacturing capacity so vast that it could maintain abundance not merely for its own troops but even for captured enemies in overseas internment camps. In the final accounting, the meaning of the cigarette was simple and devastating. An American soldier could take for granted supplies of cigarettes that seemed almost infinite. A German soldier at the end of the war could not obtain even the theoretical minimum. Between those two facts lay the entire explanation for the war's outcome. The transformation occurred not through propaganda or ideology, but through material reality. The system that could provide cigarettes to enemies even at the moment of their surrender was demonstrating a kind of power that no martial doctrine could overcome. The democracy that had seemed weak and decadent from the perspective of Nazi Berlin had revealed itself to be possessed of an industrial and economic capacity that was simply incomparable. The freedom that had seemed to constitute a weakness, the ability of workers to organize production without central ideological supervision, the ability of companies to manufacture consumer goods alongside military supplies, the ability of the system to function without the constant intervention of state terror. This freedom had actually generated a productive capacity that totalitarianism could not match. The cigarettes that were distributed at the moment of German surrender, offered casually to men who had come to constitute them as virtually impossible luxuries, represented the beginning of a new understanding. The prisoners who smoked American cigarettes in camps throughout the United States, who later returned to Germany and became businessmen and politicians and advocates for Western integration, carried with them a lived understanding of what abundance could mean. They had not been convinced by arguments. They had been convinced by the simple experience of receiving cigarettes in unlimited quantities at 5 cents per pack, of eating chocolate that had been manufactured in such quantities that it could be distributed without concern for scarcity, of witnessing the scale of an industrial machine that could produce not merely weapons but also luxuries. The symbolism extends beyond the immediate historical moment. The cigarette became a permanent symbol of the ideological struggle that had consumed Europe. In the decades that followed the war, as Germany rebuilt and became integrated into the Western system, former prisoners and soldiers would reflect on the cigarettes they had smoked in American camps. They had become a kind of sacred object in the process of converting defeated enemies into committed allies. One veteran who had been captured at El Alamein and spent the remainder of the war in an American camp wrote in his memoirs, published in 1952, "They won the war with cigarettes. Not the war itself, but the peace. They won us with chocolate and cigarettes and the understanding that even their enemy soldiers would be treated according to rules that we had violated throughout Europe." When I returned to Germany and saw what communism had begun to do in the eastern part of the country, I thought of those cigarettes. I thought of how different everything was. I understood that freedom meant the ability to manufacture cigarettes without permission, to distribute them without approval from a central authority, to sell them for whatever the market would bear. That freedom was worth defending. The cigarette was abundant because the system that produced it had structured itself to tolerate, indeed to require, a certain amount of inefficiency and waste. American capitalism allowed for overproduction, for advertising, for competition, for the kind of economic dynamism that resulted in more goods than could possibly be consumed. The communist and fascist systems, by contrast, attempted to calculate consumption precisely, to eliminate waste, to direct all resources toward specified objectives. This attempt at perfect efficiency had resulted in the opposite: chronic scarcity, allocation systems that could not function, supply chains that broke under the strain of modern industrial warfare. The reality that emerged from the rubble of the Third Reich was that the system organized around freedom, around markets, around the possibility of individual economic decisions, had generated abundance, while the system organized around centralized control and ideological direction had generated scarcity. The war had been, in many of its aspects, a contest between two theories of how modern industrial society should be organized. The contest had been won not by the system with the most brutal ideology or the most centralized command structure, but by the system that had managed to maintain enough economic freedom to generate the productive capacity necessary to supply soldiers with an excess of goods, including luxuries like cigarettes and chocolate. The German soldiers who returned from American camps and became the foundation of West Germany's reconstruction carried within them a lived understanding of this truth. They had experienced it not in the form of theoretical argument, but in the concrete form of a cigarette. 6 cigarettes per day was what they had been promised in Germany. Unlimited cigarettes at 5 cents per pack was what they encountered in America. That difference, multiplied across millions of soldiers and millions of products, had determined the fate of nations. In the years after the war, when the Marshall Plan was implemented, when West Germany was rebuilt and reintegrated into a Western system based on markets and democratic governance, the cigarettes did not cease to be a symbol, but their meaning transformed. They became no longer a symbol of scarcity and defeat, but a symbol of recovery and abundance. The factories that had once tried to produce cigarettes for soldiers were converted to other purposes. The agricultural lands that had been devoted to tobacco production continued to support the crop. And the cigarettes that flowed into West Germany, often from American companies, became a tangible reminder of what freedom could produce. The ultimate irony was perfect in its historical precision. The Third Reich had attempted to control every aspect of human consumption and production. It had created bureaucratic systems to allocate even the smallest luxuries, and in doing so it had ensured scarcity. Meanwhile, the system that had been derided as decadent and wasteful, the system that allowed for capitalist competition and the production of luxuries that were not strictly necessary for military victory, had instead generated abundance sufficient to supply not merely its own troops but even the troops of the enemy after victory had been achieved. The cigarette, that small object that had been allocated to soldiers as a morale device and a psychological necessity, became in retrospect a complete indictment of one system and a validation of another. It had been the medium through which German soldiers learned, not through propaganda but through lived experience, that they had been fighting for a cause that had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the world, a miscalculation of the relative power of competing industrial systems. The lesson persisted after the war. Veterans who had been prisoners in American camps spoke to younger Germans of what they had experienced. They spoke of the abundance, of the chocolate, of the cigarettes that seemed infinite. They spoke of an America that had seemed powerful because it had the capacity to be generous even to its enemies. And this memory, preserved in the minds of men who had served in the Wehrmacht and survived to rebuild their nation, became a part of the psychological foundation upon which West German commitment to the Western Alliance was constructed. By the 1950s, when the cigarette had returned to abundance in a recovered Germany, the historical meaning of the wartime allocation system had been completely inverted. The 6 cigarettes per day that had once represented the theoretical maximum of German military rationing had become a historical artifact, a symbol of a failed system and a discredited ideology. The unlimited cigarettes available at German tobacco shops, the products of both domestic and international manufacturers, had become a symbol of freedom and prosperity. The fundamental truth that the cigarettes encoded was this: freedom generates abundance. Control generates scarcity. The system that attempted to control every aspect of production and consumption had ultimately been defeated not by a system that was more authoritarian or more controlling, but by a system that was less controlled, more chaotic, more wasteful, and paradoxically, because of those very qualities, more productive. The American system had allowed for overproduction, for competition, for the manufacture of things that were not strictly necessary. And in allowing for these inefficiencies, It had generated a productive capacity so vast that it could support the destruction of enemies and still provide enough resources to supply them with cigarettes after their defeat. In the final analysis, the cigarette represented the materialization of freedom, not freedom in the abstract philosophical sense, but freedom in the concrete sense of the ability to produce, to consume, to exchange goods according to individual preference rather than centralized directive. It represented the triumph of a system that, despite its many flaws and inequities, had maintained enough space for individual economic decision-making, that it could generate abundance where control had generated only scarcity. The soldiers who smoked American cigarettes in the camps of Texas and North Carolina and elsewhere across the United States learned this lesson in their hands and in their lungs. They learned it in the simplicity of walking into a camp store and purchasing cigarettes at 5 cents per pack. They learned it in the awareness that there would be more cigarettes tomorrow and the day after that without limitation or authorization required. They learned it in the contrast between this experience and the memory of rationing in Germany, of allocation systems that had promised 6 but delivered 1, of a state apparatus that had attempted to control even this smallest element of human pleasure, and in doing so, had ensured its own collapse. The cigarettes were democracy, the chocolate was freedom, and the abundance in which both were available was the defining characteristic of a system that would ultimately reshape the world in its image, not through conquest, but through the simple fact of having generated more of what humans desired than any competing system could produce. The victory was not won by the military with the best doctrine or the ideology, with the most comprehensive theoretical foundation. It was won by the economic system that, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, had maintained enough freedom within itself to generate the productive capacity necessary to overwhelm all competitors. In this light, the cigarettes that German prisoners smoked in American camps were not merely morale boosters or simple luxuries. They were messengers, carriers of a truth about the world that could not be argued away but could only be experienced. And that experience, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, became the foundation of a new understanding that would guide the reconstruction of Europe in the decades that followed. The cigarettes were history itself, made manifest in the smallest possible form, teaching a lesson that no propaganda could teach, that abundance and freedom were inseparable, and that the system that could maintain the space for individuals to pursue their own interests could ultimately produce more than the system that had eliminated such space in the service of total state control. The war had ended with surrender and occupation, but the psychological reconstruction that would determine the post-war order had begun with cigarettes, with chocolate, with the simple fact of abundance offered without condition to men who had been prepared to resist. Freedom had won, not through force alone, but through the demonstration that it could produce. And the symbol of that victory would be remembered not as tanks or aircraft or weapons of any kind, but as the small luxury of a cigarette at 5 cents per pack, unlimited in quantity, offered in a place where nothing was supposed to be unlimited except the ideology of the state that had been defeated.